The billionaire believed his hearing was gone forever, until his new maid found the cure hidden deep in the trash. Norwood Manor stands like a fortress of glass and steel on the edge of the city cliffs. It is a masterpiece of modern architecture, filled with priceless art and cutting-edge technology, yet it remains as silent as a crypt. The silence here isn't peaceful. It is heavy, like velvet drapes spun from lead, muffling not just sound, but life itself. Inside these soundproofed walls lives Thomas Norwood, the mastermind behind the country's largest tech empire. His innovations run the world: smart cities, communication grids, artificial intelligence. Yet for the last 10 years, Thomas hasn't heard a single sound. Following a catastrophic lab explosion that claimed his hearing, his world shrank to the visual spectrum. For a decade, Thomas has navigated this silent existence, relying on exactly one person: Sarah Judkins, his chief operating officer. Sarah stepped in when the smoke cleared, becoming the only bridge between Thomas and his vast empire. Everyone in the company, from the board members to the cleaning staff, knows the drill. Sarah is Thomas's ears. Sarah translates the world. Sarah decides who gets access. The staff whispers about her with a kind of fearful reverence. Ms. Judkins is so dedicated, they say. She's given her life to help him. Sarah accepts these whispers with a cold, sharp smile that never quite reaches her eyes. She has woven herself so tightly into Thomas's existence that removing her would be like trying to remove a spine. From his panoramic office, Thomas reviews billion-dollar mergers on his tablet, signing off on decisions that shift global markets. To an outsider, he looks like a titan of industry, a genius who overcame tragedy through sheer will. But silence, when it is curated by someone else, isn't just a disability. It's a weapon. And Thomas Norwood isn't the king of his castle. He is a prisoner in an open cell. This is where the story takes a terrifying turn. Hey, my story family. Before we unravel this twisted web of betrayal, I need a favor from you right now. Smash that subscribe button. Seriously, don't scroll past. Like this video, and I want you to comment below. If you found out your boss was hiding a dark secret, would you expose them or stay quiet? Let's get the discussion going. We are uploading thrilling stories every day, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's get into this. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while Sarah is away at a conference, the household routine is disrupted. A new maid, Irene Bloomfield, is tasked with watering the plants in the one room no one is ever allowed to enter: Sarah's private study. Irene is different from the other staff. She doesn't rush, and she notices things others miss. She moves through the mansion not with the nervous energy of most new staff, but with a quiet confidence. More importantly, she doesn't treat Thomas like he is made of glass. As Irene navigates around Sarah's mahogany desk, her elbow catches a heavy ceramic pot. It shatters, spilling dark soil into the wastebasket beneath the desk. Sighing, Irene kneels to clean the mess, sifting through shredded documents and coffee pods. But then, her hand brushes against something that shouldn't be there. Buried deep in the refuse is a medical blister pack, unopened and glowing with a faint, rhythmic red light. Irene, who used to be a medical technician before hard times fell upon her family, freezes. She recognizes the label instantly: Apex Red, neurostimulator. It's not just a piece of tech, it's the missing key to Thomas's silence. And it wasn't lost. It was thrown away. The rain began shortly after Sarah Judkins' black sedan disappeared through the iron gates of Norwood Manor. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a deluge, hammering against the reinforced glass of the cliffside estate like thousands of tiny, frantic fists. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. With the departure of the chief operating officer for an overnight conference in Geneva, the manor exhaled. The staff, usually rigid and invisible, moved with a slightly looser gait. Shoulders dropped an inch. The air, typically thick with the static charge of Sarah's scrutiny, thinned out. But for Irene Bloomfield, the tension didn't dissipate. It merely changed shape. Mrs. Judkins left specific instructions for the ficus lirata in her study, the house manager, Mr. Henderson, said, handing Irene a key card with a heaviness that suggested he was passing her a live grenade. She claims the regular service missed it. She wants it watered. Strictly water. Don't touch the blinds. Don't move the papers. And for the love of God, Irene, don't linger. Irene took the card, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. She had been at Norwood Manor for 3 weeks, long enough to learn the unspoken geography of the house. There were the common areas, cold and museum-like. There were Mr. Norwood's quarters, silent and solitary. And then there was the East Wing office, Sarah's domain. "I'll be quick," Irene promised. Walking down the East Wing corridor felt like walking into a different climate zone. The temperature dropped. The art on the walls shifted from classical landscapes to sharp, aggressive abstract pieces, slashes of red and black that looked more like wounds than paint. Irene swiped the card. The lock beeped a harsh, dissonant note, and the heavy oak door swung open. The office was a shrine to control. It was vast, dominated by a desk made of glass and chrome that looked less like furniture and more like an altar. Behind it, a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the stormy Atlantic, gray waves churning violently below. The room smelled of ozone, expensive leather, and the bitter, lingering scent of stale espresso. Irene shivered. Even empty, the room felt occupied. It felt like Sarah was standing just out of sight, watching. She spotted the plant in the corner, a towering fiddle-leaf fig that looked as miserable as the staff. Its leaves were dusty and drooping, trapped in an oversized, ornate ceramic pot that looked heavy enough to anchor a ship. "All right, you poor thing," Irene whispered. The sound of her own voice startled her. In this house, silence was the default setting. She moved to the adjacent kitchenette, filled the watering can, and returned. The pot was positioned awkwardly behind a sleek leather armchair. Irene had to squeeze into the gap, leaning over the chair to reach the soil. As she tipped the can, her foot caught on the edge of the thick wool rug. It happened in slow motion. A teodentantadistort, cascade of physics she couldn't stop. She lurched forward. Her hip checked the side of the heavy ceramic pot. The planter wobbled on its stand, tipped past the point of no return, and crashed onto the hardwood floor. Crash. The sound was explosive. It echoed off the glass walls, a gunshot of destruction in the silent house. Irene froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the door to burst open, for security to come running. But the hallway remained empty. The rain continued to beat against the windows, indifferent to her disaster. "No, no, no," she hissed, dropping to her knees. The beautiful ceramic pot was shattered into jagged shards. Dark, damp soil was spilled across the pristine oak floor, spreading toward the white rug. The plant lay on its side, roots exposed, looking like a casualty of war. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. This was a firing offense. In any other house, it might be an accident. In Sarah Judkins' house, it was insubordination. She needed this job. She needed the money for her mother's dialysis. She couldn't afford to be walked out by security because she tripped on a rug. Clean it up. Fix it. Hide it. Irene scrambled, using her hands to scoop the heavy, wet soil into a pile. She needed a container. She looked around frantically and spotted the stainless steel wastebasket tucked under the glass desk. She grabbed it and pulled it out. It was surprisingly heavy. For a woman who projected an image of absolute, sterile perfection, Sarah Judkins was apparently a chaotic slob in private. The bin was overflowing. Empty espresso pods, crumpled tissues, and mounds of shredded paper formed a dense layer of refuse. "Just make room," Irene muttered to herself, shoving the trash down to create space for the broken pottery shards. She scooped up a handful of soil and dumped it in. She reached for a large, curved shard of the ceramic pot. But as she dropped it into the bin, it sliced through the layer of shredded paper, displacing the trash. Something slid to the side. It wasn't paper. It was a rigid, plastic rectangle, glinting in the gray afternoon light. Irene paused. The object looked out of place among the coffee pods and office debris. It looked medical. She reached in, brushing aside a clump of wet coffee grounds, and pulled the object out. It was a blister pack, the kind used for high-end sterile medical devices. It was reinforced, tamper-proof, and stamped with a silver holographic seal that had been broken. Irene sat back on her heels, the broken pot forgotten for a moment. She wasn't just a maid. Before the medical bills piled up, before the double shifts and the desperation, Irene had been a Level 2 supply technician at St. Jude's Hospital. She knew what medical packaging looked like. She knew how to read the codes. Her eyes scanned the label, her brain switching from cleaning panic to clinical analysis in a heartbeat. Device, XT processor, Apex, red type, cochlear, neurostimulator, link patient, Norwood, Thomas J. status, prototype, urgent delivery. Irene's breath caught in her throat. She knew about Thomas's accident. Everyone did. It was part of the company lore, the tragedy that built the myth of the Silent King. An explosion. Total auditory nerve destruction. Irreversible. That was the story Sarah told the press, the board, and the staff. Irreversible. But neurostimulator link didn't mean irreversible. It meant the internal hardware, the receiver, the electrode array, was already inside his skull. It meant the surgery had been done years ago, likely right after the accident. The device in her hand. This was the key. This was the external processor. The battery. The microphone. The brain. Without this, the implant in Thomas's head was just a piece of dormant wire. With this, he could hear. Irene turned the package over. Her hands, covered in potting soil, shook slightly, smearing dirt on the pristine plastic. The device itself was still inside. Why was it inside? She popped the plastic shell open further. It hadn't been emptied. The unit was nestled in the custom foam insert. It was small, sleek, and deep crimson, a terrifyingly advanced piece of technology no bigger than a large hearing aid. A tiny red LED on the side blinked once, sluggishly. It was in standby mode. "It's here," she whispered. "Why is it here?" If Thomas had ordered this, it would be in the medical wing. It would be with his doctors. It wouldn't be buried under 3 inches of shredded contracts and espresso pods in his COO's trash can. She looked at the shipping label adhered to the foil backing. Delivery date: Oaked 14, 9:39. Irene felt the blood drain from her face. October 14th. That was yesterday. This wasn't old trash. This wasn't a rejected prototype from 5 years ago that hadn't worked. This had arrived via courier yesterday morning. Sarah must have intercepted the package, brought it into her office, opened it, and then she had thrown it away. Irene looked up at the empty desk. The chaotic state of the room suddenly made sense. It wasn't just messy, it was frantic. The shredded paper wasn't just trash, it was camouflage. Sarah Judkins hadn't just made a mistake. She had committed a crime, a moral atrocity. For 10 years, Thomas Norwood had lived in a silent prison. He believed he was broken. He believed there was no fix. And all the while, the technology existed. It had been shipped to his house. and the woman he trusted to be his voice had taken his cure and buried it in the garbage like a used napkin. A wave of nausea rolled over Irene. The sheer malice of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just about control. It was about cruelty. To let a man live in silence when he didn't have to. To let him struggle to communicate. To let him be isolated, dependent, and lonely, just to keep her grip on his checkbook. Irene looked down at the device in her hand. The tiny red light pulsed again. Stronger, this time, as if sensing the heat of her hand. Apex red. It was heavy, dense with expensive circuitry. She looked at the mess on the floor, the broken pot, the dirt, the evidence of her clumsiness. 5 minutes ago, Irene was terrified of losing her job. She was afraid of the power Sarah Judkins held over her paycheck. Now, as she gripped the plastic blister pack, the fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard knot of indignation. It burned in her chest, hotter than the shame of the broken pot. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the way he stood by the window earlier that day, his forehead resting against the cold glass, looking out at a world he couldn't hear. She thought of the reverent pity the staff gave him, the way they treated him like a fragile, broken doll. He wasn't broken. He was just unplugged, and Sarah had hidden the plug. Irene wiped her dirty hand on her apron. She didn't put the device back in the trash. She didn't cover it with shredded paper. She stood up. The broken pot lay at her feet, a ruin of soil and ceramic. It didn't matter anymore. Let the ficus die. Let the rug be stained. The real mess wasn't on the floor. It was in the soul of the woman who owned this office. Irene slid the Apex red blister pack into the deep pocket of her apron. It felt heavy against her hip, a secret that weighed 1,000 pounds. She would clean the floor. She would water the damn plant. She would leave the room exactly as she found it, save for one thing. Sarah Judkins had left the house unguarded for 24 hours. She thought her secrets were safe in the shredder. She thought the help was too invisible, too stupid, or too scared to notice. She was wrong. Irene Bloomfield turned to the shattered pot and began to sweep, her movements efficient and sharp. The silence in the room seemed to press in on her, but it didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like the calm before a very loud storm. The device sat on Irene's narrow mattress like an unexploded ordnance. Her staff quarters were small, a box of beige drywall and linoleum tucked into the manor's lower levels. But for the first time, the room felt cavernous, filled with the terrifying magnitude of what she had stolen. It was 2 a.m. The storm outside had reduced to a sullen drizzle, but Irene hadn't slept. The crimson device, freed from its plastic blister pack, rested on her pillow. It was smaller than she expected, a sleek curve of matte polymer and titanium contact points. It looked innocent. It looked like a Bluetooth earpiece for a businessman. But in Irene's hands it felt heavier than lead. She sat cross-legged, the blue light of her smartphone illuminating her tired face. Her browser history was a scrolling list of frantic queries. Norwood Industries Accident Report, 2014. Cochlear implant versus auditory brainstem implant. Apex red prototype specs. Lost medical device. Protocols. She tapped a link to a dense medical journal article dated 4 years prior. The text was dry, academic, and riddled with jargon. But Irene's eyes, trained by years in hospital supply closets and nursing stations, picked out the keywords instantly. Project Apex represents a leap forward in neuroprosthetics. Unlike traditional cochlear implants that stimulate the cochlear nerve, the Apex system utilizes a direct-to-cortex receiver for patients with total nerve severance. The internal receiver is surgically placed at the base of the skull. Irene scrolled down to the diagrams. Figure A showed the internal receiver. Figure B showed the external processor, the exact red device sitting on her pillow. Requires specific pairing between the internal receiver and the external processor. Once activated, the neural bridge is instantaneous. She dropped the phone on the bed and rubbed her temples. It wasn't just a hearing aid. It was the second half of a bridge. Thomas Norwood didn't just need this device. He already had the other half inside him. She closed her eyes, recalling the faint, thin scar she had noticed behind Thomas's ear when she'd served him coffee a week ago. At the time, she assumed it was a remnant of the explosion that took his hearing. Now she knew it was a surgical port. The realization made her stomach turn. Sarah Judkins hadn't just withheld a piece of technology. She had rendered a dangerous, invasive surgery useless. Thomas had gone under the knife, endured the recovery, and had a piece of hardware installed in his skull, only for Sarah to throw the key in the trash. Irene looked at the apex red again. The tiny LED light pulsed once every 10 seconds. A slow, waiting heartbeat. If she was wrong, if she marched upstairs and stuck this thing in the billionaire's ear and it did nothing, she would be fired. That was the best-case scenario. Worst case, she'd be arrested for theft of corporate property and trespassing. She'd lose the income her mother desperately needed for dialysis. She'd be blacklisted. But if she was right? She thought of Thomas's face, not the silent king face he wore for the magazines, but the face she saw when he thought no one was looking. The hollowness, the way he watched conversations he couldn't join, his eyes tracking lips like a starving man watching a feast. To stay silent was to be complicit. To do nothing was to join Sarah Judkins in that dark, cold place where money mattered more than humanity. Irene finally lay down, but she didn't turn off the light. She curled her hand around the device, her thumb brushing the smooth plastic. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered into the dark, thinking of the paycheck she was risking. "But I have to." The next afternoon, the atmosphere in Norwood Manor curdled. Sarah Judkins returned at 1:12 p.m., 4 hours earlier than expected. The slam of the heavy front door reverberated through the house, shaking the crystal in the chandeliers. Irene was in the upstairs hallway, polishing a console table, when Sarah stormed up the grand staircase. The COO looked immaculate in a sharp gray suit, but her energy was jagged. She was on her phone, pacing, her heels clicking against the marble like gunfire. "I don't care what the SEC filing says, Gerald. Delay the audit. Tell them Thomas is unavailable. Tell them he's indisposed." Sarah paused, listening to the voice on the other end, her face twisting into a sneer. "Because I said so. He trusts me. He doesn't need to see the raw data. It would just confuse him." Irene froze, her polishing cloth hovering over the wood. The device was in her apron pocket. It banged against her hip with every movement, a solid, accusing weight. Sarah reached the landing and spotted Irene. She stopped mid-stride, lowering the phone. Her eyes, cold and predatory, narrowed. "You," Sarah said. Irene straightened, clutching the cloth. "Ms. Judkins, welcome back." Sarah didn't return the pleasantry. She stepped closer, invading Irene's personal space. She smelled of rain and expensive metallic perfume. "Did you water the plant in my office?" "Yes, ma'am," Irene said, keeping her voice steady. "Yesterday afternoon." "Did you touch anything else?" The question was sharp, a razor wire. Sarah's gaze flicked down to Irene's apron. For a terrifying second, Irene thought she knew. She thought Sarah could see the outline of the stolen prototype through the fabric. Irene's heart hammered against her ribs, loud enough, she feared, to be heard over the storm outside. "No, ma'am," Irene lied. "Just the plant. I watered it and left immediately." Sarah stared at her for a long, uncomfortable silence. She was looking for a flinch, a tremor, a tell. Irene forced herself to maintain eye contact, channeling every ounce of discipline she had learned in the chaotic triage wards of the city hospital. Finally, Sarah sniffed dismissively. "Good. The cleaning crew is coming tomorrow. Stay out of the East Wing until then." She turned on her heel and marched toward her bedroom, lifting the phone back to her ear. "No, Gerald, listen to me. We launch the restructuring next week. Thomas will sign whatever I put in front of him. He always does." Irene watched her go, a chill running down her spine. He always does. It wasn't just about the hearing. It was a coup. Sarah was orchestrating a takeover, and Thomas's silence was the cornerstone of her strategy. As long as he was deaf, he was manageable. He was a figurehead she could prop up or knock down at will. Irene looked down the opposite end of the hallway toward the master suite. The door was ajar. She moved. She didn't run. Running drew attention. But she walked with a purpose that felt dangerous. She descended the back stairs, bypassing the kitchen where the cook was prepping dinner, and made her way to the grand parlor. She knew he would be there. It was his routine. At 2 p.m., Thomas Norwood stood by the west-facing window to watch the shipping lanes in the harbor. It was the only time of day he seemed to connect with the outside world, watching the silent movement of tankers and cargo ships. When Irene entered the parlor, the room was dim. The storm clouds had thickened, casting the luxurious space in a gloom of gray light. Thomas was there, just as she expected. He stood with his back to the room, one hand resting high on the window frame, his forehead leaning against the cool glass. He wore a dark turtleneck and slacks, looking less like a billionaire and more like a shadow cast by the window frame. The isolation radiating off him was palpable. It wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was the velvet drapes of lead she had sensed when she first arrived, but now she saw the person suffocating beneath them. He didn't hear her enter. He didn't hear the floorboards creak. He didn't hear the distant rumble of thunder. Irene stopped 10 feet away. Her hand went into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the apex red. It was warm now, absorbing her body heat. She hesitated. This was the cliff edge. Once she stepped off, there was no going back. If she startled him and he rejected her, Sarah would be alerted. If the device didn't work, she would be destroying the fragile piece of his life for nothing. "He trusts me," Sarah had said on the phone. "He doesn't need to see the raw data." Irene looked at Thomas's slumped shoulders. He looked defeated. He looked like a man who had accepted that his life was over, that he was merely waiting for the credits to roll. She remembered the medical journal, direct to cortex receiver. He wasn't broken. He was disconnected. The fear of being fired, the fear of arrest, the fear of poverty. It all suddenly seemed small compared to the immense tragedy standing in front of her. Irene took a breath. She pulled the red device from her pocket. She gripped it tightly, the plastic digging into her palm. She walked toward him. She didn't tap him on the shoulder. She didn't wave to get his attention. She stepped into his peripheral vision, moving slowly so as not to spook him. Thomas turned his head. His eyes were dull, glazed over with boredom and fatigue. When he saw her, there was a flicker of confusion. He wasn't used to the staff approaching him directly. Usually, they scurried around the edges of the room, terrified of intruding. Irene didn't look down. She didn't look submissive. She looked him straight in the eye. She saw the question in his gaze. "What do you want?" She held up her hand. Thomas frowned. He looked at her empty palm, then at her face, then back at her hand. Irene opened her fingers. The apex red sat there, dark crimson against her pale skin. The tiny LED light blinked. Pulse. Thomas's eyes widened. He froze. He recognized it. Irene saw the shock hit him like a physical blow. His breath hitched. He stared at the device with a mixture of horror and longing, as if she were holding a ghost. He reached up, his hand trembling, touching the scar behind his own ear. A reflex. A memory. Irene stepped closer. The space between them was charged, electric with 10 years of silence waiting to be broken. She didn't know sign language. She couldn't tell him. I found this in the trash. Sarah stole it. I'm here to save you. She had to show him. Thomas looked from the device to Irene's face. He looked scared. For a man who controlled billions of dollars, in that moment, he looked like a terrified child. Irene offered him a small, reassuring nod. It was the same nod she used to give patients right before a needle went in. It's going to hurt, but it's going to help. She raised the device toward his ear. Thomas flinched back, his hand coming up defensively. He shook his head, a sharp, jerky movement. No. Broken. Impossible. Irene didn't retreat. She stepped into his guard. She reached out with her free hand, and gently but firmly took hold of his wrist. She lowered his hand away from his ear. His skin was cold. His pulse was racing beneath her fingertips. She held his gaze, her expression fierce and pleading. "Trust me," her eyes said. "Trust me. Not her." Thomas stopped resisting. He didn't pull away, though every muscle in his body was tensed for impact. He stood paralyzed, trapped between hope and the crushing fear of another disappointment. Irene raised the device again. This time, he let her. She brushed his hair back. She saw the faint white line of the scar. She saw the slight indentation where the magnetic coupling of the implant sat beneath the skin. She aligned the apex red. The magnets grabbed each other with a satisfying, tactile click. Irene pulled her hand back. For a split second, there was nothing. The silence of the room held its breath. Thomas stared at her, his chest heaving, waiting. And then, the light on the side of the device turned solid green. The activation sequence began. The silence didn't break. It detonated. For Thomas, there was no gradual fade-in, no gentle swelling of orchestral music like in the movies. There was only a sudden, violent tear in the fabric of his reality. It started with a high-pitched whine, sharp as a dentist's drill, burrowing directly into the center of his skull. It was followed instantly by a percussive thump, the sound of the device syncing with the dormant cortical receiver embedded in his bone. Thomas gasped, a raw, ragged intake of breath that sounded to his own ears like a rock slide. He staggered back, his hands flying up to his head, his eyes squeezed shut against the sudden assault. The world, which had been a flat, silent canvas for 10 years, suddenly gained a terrifying third dimension. It was chaos. A roar of white noise, static, and feedback flooded his brain, drowning out his thoughts. "No!" he choked out, though he couldn't hear the word. He could only feel the vibration of it in his throat, a sensation he had forgotten how to process. He tried to claw the device from his ear. It felt like a parasite, a hot coal burning against his skin. Irene didn't let him. She moved with the desperation of a paramedic saving a patient who didn't want to be saved. She grabbed his wrists, her fingers digging into his forearms. She was shouting something, her mouth moving, but Thomas couldn't parse the sounds. It was just noise, loud, distorted, garbled noise. "Let me go." "It hurts." He tried to pull away, his larger frame easily overpowering hers, but Irene used her weight, stepping into him, forcing him back against the heavy velvet armrest of the sofa. She pinned his hands to his chest, her face inches from his. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at him with fierce, demanding intensity. "Stay with me," her eyes screamed. "Don't you dare turn it off." Thomas stopped fighting, not because the pain had stopped, but because the sheer shock paralyzed him. He slumped against the sofa, his chest, heaving. Slowly, the white noise began to recede. The solid wall of static fractured, breaking apart into distinct, sharp shards of sound. Rustle. The sound of fabric moving against fabric. It was deafening, like sandpaper on a microphone. Thud, thud, thud. A rhythmic, wet pounding. Fast. Terrified. It took Thomas a dizzying moment to realize it was his own heart. He was hearing his own blood pumping through his veins. Oh. Breath. His breath. Irene's breath. He opened his eyes. The room looked the same. The gray light. The heavy furniture. The rain streak on the glass. But it felt completely alien. It was alive. The air itself seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration. Irene was still gripping his wrists, her chest rising and falling. She was speaking now, her voice low and steady. To Thomas, it didn't sound like words yet. It sounded like a series of melodic warping noises, electronic and strange, but unmistakably human. Okay, Thomas, breathe. Just breathe. The syllables were distorted, like a radio tuned slightly off frequency, but his brain, dormant for a decade, began to fire. The neural pathways, dusty and disused, sparked to life, scrambling to decode the input. He stared at Irene's lips. He knew how to read lips. He matched the visual shape of the words to the strange sounds entering his head. Breathe. He took a breath. He heard the air rush into his lungs. Then, from the corner of the room, a new sound cut through the haze. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. Thomas flinched with every beat. He turned his head sharply toward the antique grandfather clock standing sentinel by the door. For 10 years, that clock had been a piece of furniture, a visual pendulum swinging in a void. Now, it was a hammer striking an anvil. Tick. Tock. It was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Tears pricked his eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming sensory overload. The world was so loud. How did anyone endure this? Irene released one of his wrists and gently touched his cheek, turning his face back to her. She put a finger to her lips. Shh. She was looking past him, toward the double doors of the parlor. Thomas followed her gaze. The heavy oak door was creaking open. The hinge needed oil. Thomas winced, his teeth gritting against the screech. Sarah Judkins stood in the doorway. She had changed out of her travel clothes into a pristine white blouse and black pencil skirt. She looked every inch the corporate shark, poised, sharp, immaculate. She held her phone in one hand, her thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't see Thomas's face at first. She saw Irene standing close to him. She saw Thomas slumped against the sofa, looking disoriented. I told you to wait for the cleaning crew, Sarah said. Her voice hit Thomas like a physical slap. It wasn't distorted like Irene's. It was sharp, nasal, cold. It cut through the ambient noise of the room with terrifying clarity. It was a sound he remembered. It was the sound of the last person he had spoken to before the explosion. Sarah stepped into the room, annoyance etched into her features. And what are you doing bothering Mr. Norwood? He looks distressed. She stopped, her eyes locked onto Thomas's ear. The apex red was glowing. The small LED indicator had shifted from a searching pulse to a solid, angry crimson, indicating active data transfer. In the dim light of the parlor, it looked like a burning ember attached to his skull. Sarah went pale. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her composure, usually as impenetrable as diamond, shattered. She looked at Irene. The look wasn't one of an employer reprimanding an employee. It was the look of a criminal catching a witness. Irene didn't step back. She stood her ground, placing herself slightly between Thomas and Sarah, a protective shield. Sarah took a stumbling step backward, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. She raised her phone to her ear, turning her back to them, moving toward the hallway. She assumed Thomas was still in the transition phase, confused, deaf, reeling from the noise. She assumed the dumb maid hadn't figured out how to calibrate it. She assumed the silence was still her ally. She brought the phone to her lips and covered her mouth with her hand, lowering her voice to a frantic, hushed whisper. "Gerald? Pick up. Pick up, damn you." Thomas watched her back. He watched her shoulders tense. And for the first time in 10 years, he didn't need to see her lips to know what she was saying. The whisper traveled across the room. The apex red, designed to pick up whispers in a crowded room, amplified her voice. It stripped away the ambient noise of the rain and the clock and focused entirely on the frequency of her speech. "It's over," Sarah hissed into the phone. "The maid found it. The prototype. She put it in his ear." Thomas felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the storm. The physical pain of the noise faded, replaced by a numbness that was far worse. Sarah listened for a moment, then cut the other person off. "I don't care. He's disoriented. He's in pain. We spin this. We say he had a psychotic break. We say the maid assaulted him with an unapproved medical device." She paused, glancing over her shoulder at Thomas. He remained still, staring at her, his face unreadable. She turned back to the hallway, lowering her voice even further. "We have to accelerate the competency hearing now. Tonight. Draft the papers. I'll have security remove the girl and sedate him before he figures out what the hell is happening. By the time he wakes up in a facility, I'll have power of attorney." Sedate him. Facility. Power of attorney. The words hung in the air, suspended in the electric tension of the room. Thomas looked at the woman who had sat by his hospital bed, the woman who had learned sign language for him, the woman who had held his hand during the darkest days of his isolation and told him, "I will be your voice, Thomas. I will protect you." She hadn't been protecting him. She had been burying him alive. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that it bypassed anger and settled directly into a cold, crystalline clarity. The chaotic noise of the world sharpened into focus. The static cleared. He pushed himself off the sofa. Irene reached out to steady him, but he shook his head gently. He was steady. He stood to his full height, the weariness of the last decade falling off him like a heavy coat. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Creak. A beautiful, terrible sound. Sarah heard the movement. She spun around, the phone still pressed to her ear. "I have to go. Do it now." She hung up and plastered a look of counterfeit concern onto her face. She took a step toward him, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Thomas," she said, reverting to the simplified, exaggerated enunciation she used when he was lip-reading. She didn't voice the words. She just mouthed them, assuming he couldn't hear. "You are confused. Let me help." She reached for his ear. She reached for the device. "Get away from him," Irene warned, her voice trembling but loud. "Quiet, you idiot," Sarah snapped, not bothering to look at the maid. "You've heard him. You have no idea what that thing does." She looked back at Thomas, her eyes wide and pleading. "Thomas, please, it's malfunctioning. It's dangerous. Let me take it out." She was inches away. Her perfume was cloying. Her fingernails were painted a sharp blood red. Thomas caught her wrist. He didn't grab it violently. He just stopped her hand in midair. His grip was iron. Sarah froze. She looked up at him, startled by the speed, but still confident in her control. She started to mouth the words again. "Let me." Thomas looked past Irene. He looked past the lie of his life. He locked eyes with Sarah Judkins. He took a breath. His throat felt dry, unused. His vocal cords were tight, atrophied from years of disuse. He wasn't sure what sound would come out. He wasn't sure if he could even speak properly anymore. But he had to try. He forced air through the larynx. He shaped the vowels with a tongue that felt clumsy. The word came out as a gravelly croak. Low, rough, vibration in his chest. Sarah's eyes went wide. She tried to pull her wrist back, but Thomas held fast. He swallowed and tried again, forcing the sound to obey his will. I can hear you. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of deafness. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hovering at the top of its arc. Sarah's face drained of all color. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The arrogance, the calculation, the feigned concern, it all vanished, leaving behind only naked, primal terror. Thomas, she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah, he said. His voice was gaining strength, finding its old resonance deep and dangerous. I heard everything. The sound of his own voice was the first weapon turned against him. I heard everything. The words didn't just vibrate in the air. They rattled inside Thomas's skull like loose change in a dryer. His vocal cords, stiff from a decade of silence, produced a gravelly, resonant tone that registered in his auditory cortex as a landslide. He winced, his hands flying up to cup his ears, trying to dampen the sheer, physical force of the sound. Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open, the blood drained from her face. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the room was the thud, thud, thud of Thomas's own pulse, amplified by the apex red device to the volume of a war drum. Then, Sarah blinked. The shock fractured, replaced instantly by the desperate, frantic calculation of a cornered animal. Thomas, she said, stepping forward. Her voice was a needle, sharp, piercing. The sibilance of the S hissed like a steam valve. Thomas staggered back, his hip bumping the heavy oak desk. The collision sent a vibration up his spine that manifested as a low, booming groan in his ear. He squeezed his eyes shut, teeth gritted. "It's hurting you," Sarah said, her voice pitching up into a feigned panic. "God, look at you. You're in agony? That thing isn't calibrated. It's raw input. It could fry your neural pathways." She lunged toward him, her hand outstretched, fingers curled like talons aiming for the glowing red device behind his ear. "Let me take it out. We have to take it out now." It was a good performance. If Thomas hadn't heard the phone call, the whisper about competency hearings and sedation, he might have believed the terror in her eyes was for him. But he had heard. He knew the terror was of him. He tried to raise his arm to block her, but his equilibrium was shot. The influx of sensory data made the room spin. Irene didn't hesitate. She moved with the fluid efficiency of a triage nurse handling a combatant. She stepped laterally, inserting herself into the space between the billionaire and the COO. When Sarah's hand came down, Irene caught her wrist in midair. It wasn't a gentle intercept. Irene gripped hard, twisting slightly to lock Sarah's elbow. "Don't touch him," Irene said. Her voice was lower than Sarah's, a calm alto that rumbled rather than pierced. But to Thomas, even this sounded like thunder rolling through a canyon. "Let go of me, you heavily indebted little thief," Sarah shrieked, struggling against Irene's grip. The shriek was blinding. Thomas actually saw white spots dance in his vision. The acoustic energy spiked, sending a lance of pain straight down his neck. He groaned, doubling over, clutching the edge of the desk for support. "You stole a prototype," Sarah yelled, playing to an audience that wasn't there, or perhaps trying to build her legal defense in real time. "You broke into my office. You assaulted a disabled man with unapproved medical technology. I was testing it. I was waiting for the safety protocols." "Liar," Irene said. She shoved Sarah back, putting 3 feet of distance between them. "You threw it in the trash. I found it under your coffee grounds." I was disposing of a defective unit, Sarah spat, smoothing her blazer with trembling hands. She looked past Irene, trying to catch Thomas's eye. Thomas, listen to me. She's manipulating you. She doesn't understand the science. That device is dangerous. It's amplifying everything. It's going to cause a seizure if we don't deactivate it immediately. She took another step forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood. Click-clack. Click-clack. To Thomas, it sounded like gunshots. Stop, Thomas gasped. The word was barely a whisper, but it scraped his throat. Sarah froze. Thomas! He opened his eyes. The room was too bright. The sound of the rain against the window was a constant roaring static, like a detuned television at max volume. He looked at Sarah. He saw the sweat beading on her upper lip. He heard the ragged intake of her breath wheezing slightly in her nose. Stop talking, he forced out. Every syllable was an effort. He had to relearn how to modulate his volume, how to shape the air. So, loud. I'm trying to help you, Sarah pleaded, though she lowered her voice. Even the whisper carried a serrated edge. Please, let me call Dr. Aris. Let me handle this. We can fix this. Thomas straightened up. It took every ounce of willpower he possessed. He looked at the woman who had been his gatekeeper for 10 years, the woman who had held his hand at press conferences, the woman who had told him the world was too loud, too cruel, too complex for him to navigate alone. I heard the call, Thomas rasped. His voice was gaining strength, finding the deep timbre that had once commanded boardrooms. Sedate him. Competency hearing. Sarah's mouth worked silently. The color did not return to her face. Thomas, you misunderstood, she stammered, the lie crumbling as she spoke. I was talking about a legal strategy to protect the company if the news leaked. Get out, Thomas said. He didn't shout it. He didn't have to. The command carried the weight of a decade of stolen time. Thomas, get out! The second time, he put force behind it. The shout tore from his throat, loud and raw. It hurt him more than it hurt her. The reverberation in his skull nearly sent him to his knees, but the effect was instantaneous. Sarah looked at Thomas, standing tall despite the pain, his eyes burning with a cold, newfound awareness. She looked at Irene, standing guard with fists clenched. She realized that the physical battle was lost. The parlor was no longer her domain. But the war wasn't over. Sarah's expression shifted. The panic hardened into malice. She straightened her jacket, her eyes darting to the door. You're making a mistake, she hissed. You can hear? Fine. But you can't run this company. You've been a ghost for 10 years, Thomas. You're obsolete. She turned and marched toward the door. Her exit was a calculated assault. She didn't close the heavy double doors gently. She grabbed the brass handles and slammed them shut with all her strength. Boom! The sound was apocalyptic. It hit Thomas like a physical shockwave. He cried out, a sound of pure agony, and collapsed. His knees hit the rug, and he curled into himself, pressing his hands over the glowing red device, trying desperately to shield it from the echo that bounced around the room. Thomas! Irene was there instantly. She dropped to her knees beside him. The world was spinning. The slam of the door continued to ring in his head, a high-pitched tinnitus that drowned out the rain. He felt nausea rising in his throat. Too much, he groaned, his forehead pressed against the carpet. It's too much. I know, Irene said. Her voice was right next to his ear now. She was whispering, but the proximity made it sound like she was shouting through a megaphone. I know. It's hyperacusis. Your brain isn't used to the input. It's firing everything at maximum gain. She reached for his shoulder, her touch firm and grounding. Thomas, I need you to let me touch the device, she said. I can turn it down. There's a tactile interface on the casing. I read the manual online. Thomas flinched away instinctively. The last person who touched his ear had tried to rip the device out. "Trust me," Irene said. She didn't pull away. She waited. "Please." Thomas cracked one eye open. He saw the blurry pattern of the Persian rug. He saw Irene's knees, stained with the dirt from the office plant she had knocked over. He saw her hands, clean, steady, waiting. He nodded, a fraction of an inch. Irene moved slowly. "I'm going to touch your ear now." Her fingers brushed his skin. Her hands were cool. The contrast to the burning heat of the device was soothing. "Okay," she murmured, more to herself than him. "Top ridge is volume, bottom ridge is sensitivity." She slid her finger along the top curve of the apex red unit. Beep. The world stepped back. The roar of the rain softened. The ticking of the clock went from a hammer strike to a dull tap. Beep. She swiped again. The static hiss in Thomas's head receded further. The throbbing pain behind his eyes began to uncoil. "Better?" Irene asked. Her voice was no longer a thunderclap. It was soft. Human. It still sounded strange, electronic and slightly processed, but it didn't hurt. Thomas exhaled, his breath shuddering out of him. He rolled onto his side, looking up at her. For the first time, he really heard the ambient sound of the room, the settling of the house, the distant wind. It was chaotic, yes, but it wasn't attacking him anymore. "Better," he whispered. "Thank you." Irene didn't smile. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice urgent. "Sarah didn't just leave. She's going to her office. She said she needs to lock down the accounts." Thomas pushed himself up to a sitting position. The dizziness swirled, then settled. He felt weak, shaking with the aftershocks of the sensory explosion, but his mind was crystal clear. "She's going to cut me off," Thomas said. He looked at the closed doors. He could hear footsteps in the hallway beyond, faint, hurried, clicking heels moving away from them. He could hear them. "She's going to try to freeze the assets before I can prove I'm competent." He looked at Irene. "Help me up," he said. Irene grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. He swayed for a moment, gripping her shoulder for balance. The texture of her uniform, rough cotton, made a swish sound that he found fascinatingly detailed. "Where are we going?" Irene asked. Thomas turned toward the back of the room, toward the service entrance that led to the private corridors. "My study," Thomas said. His voice was still, raspy, but the command was absolute. "It has a hardline server connection. If she's trying to lock me out, she's going to find out that I built the system she's trying to use." He took a step, wincing slightly, as his shoe squeaked on the floor. He would have to get used to that. He would have to get used to everything. "But first," Thomas said, pausing to look at the maid who had saved his life. "We need to barricade the door. She won't come back alone." Irene nodded. She didn't ask questions. She moved to the heavy oak chair by the fireplace and began to drag it toward the double doors. Thomas listened to the scrape of the wood against the floor. It was a harsh, ugly sound, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The heavy mahogany door of Thomas's private study clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding home with a metallic thunk that echoed in the quiet room. It was the first sound in 10 years that Thomas found genuinely comforting. Irene leaned back against the wood, exhaling a breath she felt she'd been holding since she walked into the parlor. "That won't hold them forever," she said, her voice low. Thomas stood in the center of the room. His study was a stark contrast to the rest of the manor. Where the house was a museum of cold marble and velvet, this room was a nerve center. Walls of monitors, currently dark, lined the perimeter. A dedicated server rack hummed in the corner. A low, steady drone that Thomas could feel in his teeth as much as hear in his ears. "It doesn't have to hold them forever," Thomas said. His voice was gaining traction, the rust scraping away with every sentence, revealing the baritone steel beneath. "It just has to hold them until morning." He walked to his desk, his movement stiff but determined. The sensory input was still a barrage. The scuff of his shoes, the distant rumble of the storm, the whir of the air conditioning. But he was learning to compartmentalize. He focused on the visual, the keyboard, the screen, the things he could control. He sat down and woke the system. The monitors flickered to life, casting a cool blue glow over his face. "You said she mentioned a hearing," Irene said, moving away from the door to stand beside his desk. She didn't hover like a servant anymore. She stood like a second in command. "A competency hearing," Thomas corrected, typing rapidly. The clack, clack, clack of the mechanical keys was incredibly loud, like tiny firecrackers. He winced, but didn't stop. "She's going to claim I've had a mental break, that I'm hallucinating, that the isolation finally cracked me." He paused, looking up at Irene. The green light of the Apex red device reflected faintly on his cheek. "If she files the emergency motion before the market opens, the board can suspend my voting rights. She'll have interim control. By the time I get a lawyer to a courtroom to prove I can hear, she'll have gutted the accounts and moved the assets offshore." "She can't do that in 12 hours, Irene argued. "She's been preparing for this for 10 years, Thomas said grimly. "She didn't just want to be my voice, Irene. She wanted to be me." He hit a final key, and the center screen filled with a complex directory of files. "She thinks I'm locked out. She thinks because she controls the admin passwords to the corporate servers, she controls everything." A dark, humorless smile touched his lips. "She forgot who wrote the source code." Thomas navigated through the back doors he had left for himself years ago. Digital breadcrumbs, from a time when he still thought he was just a CEO, not a prisoner. He bypassed the standard logs and accessed the raw communication archives. "I need to find the order," Thomas muttered. "The delivery manifest for the device." He opened a folder labeled Logistics, Incoming, Medical. "There," Irene pointed. A file dated October 14th. Thomas clicked it. An audio file attached to a digital scan. "It's a voicemail," Thomas said, his hand hovering over the mouse. "From the courier service." He pressed play. The sound that burst from the desktop speakers was a garbled nightmare. To a normal ear, it was a slightly grainy recording of a delivery driver. To Thomas, whose auditory cortex was still raw and uncalibrated, it was a distorted screech of frequency spikes and unintelligible vowels. "Zitlo, this is DRV from them." Thomas recoiled, clamping his hands over his ears. The pain was immediate, a spike driving behind his eyes. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't parse it. The frequencies are all wrong." He reached to stop it, but Irene's hand covered his. "Don't stop it," she said. She leaned in closer to the speaker, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'll transcribe. Just let it play." Thomas nodded, squeezing his eyes shut to block out the visual noise so he could endure the auditory chaos. The message played out, a 30-second torture session of static and voice. When it ended, the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy. Irene grabbed a notepad from the desk. She wrote quickly, her pen scratching loudly against the paper. She turned the pad toward him. Transcript. "Hello, this is Dave from MedExpress. I'm at the gate. The intercom isn't working, but Ms. Judkins came out to sign for the package. Priority medical delivery for Mr. Norwood. Tracking number 884 Bravo X-ray. She said she'd bring it up personally. Have a good day." Thomas read the words. He read them twice. She signed for it, Thomas whispered. She met the driver at the gate, so he wouldn't come to the door. So the cameras wouldn't see him hand it to staff. He turned back to the computer, his fury sharpening his focus. He typed in the tracking number Irene had transcribed. A document popped up. It wasn't the delivery confirmation. It was an internal memo drafted by Sarah Judkins, dated October 15th, the day after the delivery. Subject, incident report. Lost item status, resolved item 894BX, prototype MEDOR unit. Lost in transit due to carrier error. Insurance claim filed. Do not inform Mr. Norwood. Avoid causing unnecessary distress regarding failed treatments. Unnecessary distress, Thomas read aloud. The words tasted like ash. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The evidence was right there. It wasn't just negligence. It was active, documented malice. She had intercepted the cure, signed for it, thrown it in the trash, and then filed a report blaming the carrier, all to keep him deaf. Why? Irene asked softly. You're worth billions. She was already rich being your COO. Why do this? Thomas stood up and walked to the window. The storm was raging harder now, the wind howling against the glass. He listened to it, the raw, untamed power of the weather. Because I was going to fire her, he said. He didn't turn around. He watched the rain distort the lights of the distant city. 10 years ago, right before the accident, I found discrepancies in the R&D budget. Small things, vendor kickbacks, inflated consulting fees. I confronted her. She cried. She said it was a mistake. I told her we would review it after I got back from the lab inspection. Thomas touched the cold glass. I never came back from the inspection. The lab exploded. I woke up in a hospital bed, deaf, confused, and terrified. And Sarah was there. She was the only one who could understand me. She was the only one I could lean on. I forgot about the kickbacks. I forgot about the audit. I was just trying to survive. He turned to face Irene. She didn't just take advantage of the accident, Irene. She reveled in it. As long as I was deaf, she was the interpreter. She could filter the world. If a board member asked about the budget, Sarah translated the question as a concern about product timelines. If I asked for financial reports, she gave me sanitized summaries. He tapped the side of his head, near the glowing red device. This silence wasn't a disability. It was her greatest asset. Irene looked at the lost in transit report on the screen, then back at him. Her expression hardened. Then let's take it back. We need more, Thomas said, moving back to the desk. The lost package proves she hid the device, but to stop the competency hearing, to prove she's unfit now, I need to show she's stealing. I need the money trail. Where would she hide it? Not on the main server, Thomas said, his fingers flying across the keys again. Click, click, click. She's too smart for that. She'd keep a shadow ledger. Something local. Something. He paused. He looked at the transcript Irene had written. Ms. Judkins came out to sign for the package. The gate logs, Thomas said. She met the courier at the gate. He pulled up the security system for the estate. He accessed the video archives for October 14th. He scrubbed through the timeline. 09:30 a.m. There it was. The grain of the security camera was high, but the image was clear. A delivery van. A man in a uniform handing a package to Sarah Judkins. But Sarah wasn't alone. Thomas squinted at the screen. Who was that? Standing just inside the gate, half obscured by the shadows of the security booth, was a man. Sarah handed the package to him first. He inspected it, then handed it back to her. Then she handed him a thick white envelope. Thomas zoomed in. That's Gerald, he said, his voice dropping to a growl. Gerald Vance, our general counsel, the head of legal. The man she was talking to on the phone, Irene realized. the one she told to draft the competency papers. "It's not just her," Thomas said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "It's the legal department, maybe the CFO. She's built a cabal." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. Both Thomas and Irene jumped. The sound was distinct, a heavy fist pounding against the study door. "Mr. Norwood?" a voice shouted. It was muffled by the heavy wood, but distinct enough. "Mr. Norwood, this is security. We need you to open the door, sir." Thomas looked at the door. He looked at Irene. "They're here," Irene whispered. "We have a medical team en route, sir," the guard shouted. "Ms. Judkins says you've suffered a seizure. We need to check your vitals." "They're not going to check my vitals," Thomas said quietly. "They're going to stick a needle in my arm and wake me up in a psych ward 3 days from now." He turned back to the computer. "I need to copy these files. The video, the memo, the voicemail." He pulled a thumb drive from his desk drawer and jammed it into the port. The progress bar appeared on the screen. "Copying. 10%, bang, bang, bang. Open the door or we will be forced to breach." The handle jiggled violently. The deadbolt rattled in its housing. "How much time?" Irene asked, watching the door with wide eyes. 2 minutes for the transfer," Thomas said. "Maybe less." Copying. 35%. There was a pause in the pounding. Then, the sound of metal on metal. A drilling sound. "They're drilling the lock," Thomas said. He looked around the room. It was a fortress of information, but physically, it was a trap. There was only one door. The windows were reinforced hurricane glass, great for storms, impossible to break without tools. "We can't go out the hallway," Irene said. She rushed to the window, looking down. "It's a 30-foot drop to the terrace." Thomas looked at the progress bar. 60%. He looked at Irene. She was scanning the room, her mind clearly racing through escape scenarios. She wasn't panicking. She was problem-solving. "Irene," Thomas said. She turned to him. "Why?" he asked. "You found the device yesterday. You could have walked away. You could have anonymously mailed it to the police. Why are you in this room, risking jail, for a man you don't even know?" Irene looked at the door, where the drill was whining louder and louder, then back at him. "Because my mother is deaf," she said. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. "She lost her hearing when I was 12, Irene continued, her voice steady. "We didn't have money for implants. We didn't have billions. I watched her world shrink. I watched people treat her like she was stupid just because she couldn't hear. I swore if I ever could help someone." She trailed off. "I'm not doing this for the billionaire, Thomas," she said. "I'm doing it for the man in the window who looked like he was drowning." Thomas stared at her. For 10 years, people had looked at him with pity, greed, or fear. No one had looked at him with simple, unadulterated solidarity. "Copying." 100% transfer complete, Thomas said, yanking the drive. He shoved it into his pocket. The sound of the drill stopped. Then, a heavy crack as the lock cylinder snapped. "They're coming in," Thomas said. He moved to the bookshelf behind his desk. He grabbed a heavy bronze statue, an abstract piece that Sarah had bought for him, ironically titled, "Silence." "We're not going out the door," Thomas said. He turned to the large ventilation grate near the floor. It was an intake for the server cooling system. "The server room," Thomas said. "This duct leads directly to the basement maintenance shaft. It bypasses the hallway." He used the bronze statue to smash the latch on the grate. Clang! The sound was deafening in the small room, but Thomas didn't flinch. He was done flinching. He kicked the grate open. A rush of cold air and the roar of industrial fans greeted them. "Go," Thomas ordered. The study door burst open. 3 security guards in tactical gear surged into the room. "Secure him," one shouted. Irene dove into the vent. Thomas followed, sliding into the darkness of the duct just as a taser probe sparked against the metal frame where his head had been a second before. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, the narrow metal tunnel amplifying the sound of his own breathing into a hurricane. Behind him, he heard the shouts of the guards echoing down the shaft. "He's in the vents! Cut off the basement exits!" Thomas crawled faster, the thumb drive burning a hole in his pocket. The silent war was over. The loud one had just begun. The ventilation shaft ended in a drop. Thomas pulled himself to the edge of the metal lip, his breath echoing in the confined space like a bellows. Below them was the service laundry room, a space of concrete floors, industrial washers, and the smell of bleach. "It's an 8-foot drop," Thomas whispered. Even his whisper sounded loud in the metal tube. "I go first." He didn't wait for Irene to argue. He slid his legs out, hung by his fingertips for a split second, and let go. He landed in a crouch. The impact sent a vibration up his shins, but the sound, the slap of his dress shoes against the concrete, was the real shock. It rang out, sharp and biting. Thomas froze, wincing, waiting for the echo to die. Irene dropped down beside him a second later. She landed more softly, her sneakers making a dull thud. "Staff entrance is down the north corridor," Irene hissed, grabbing his arm. "My car is in the lower lot." They moved past the rows of silent, hulking washing machines. To Thomas, the room was alive with unseen noises, the drip of a faucet, the hum of a refrigerator compressor, the distant settling of the foundation. It was a chaotic orchestra he was still learning to conduct. They reached the heavy fire door that led to the service corridor. Irene reached for the handle, but Thomas grabbed her wrist, stopping her. He pressed a finger to his lips and pointed at the door. Voices. Through the steel, muffled but intelligible, came the sound of heavy boots and casual conversation. "Don't get paid enough to chase a lunatic through a storm," a deep voice grumbled. "Easy money, though," a second voice replied. Lighter. Younger. "Ms. Judkins said he's totally gone. Snapped. Thinks he can hear angels or some shit." Thomas stiffened. He recognized the second voice. It was Miller, one of the daytime perimeter guards. Thomas had signed a birthday card for him last year. Sarah had told him Miller was devoted to the family. "Doesn't matter what he thinks," the deep voice laughed. "It's tragic, really. The deaf dummy running around in the vents like a rat. Once Doc Harris sticks him with the needle, he'll be quiet enough. Quiet as a tomb, just how Judkins likes him." The cruelty of it struck Thomas harder than the physical danger. They weren't just following orders, they were mocking him. For 10 years, he had walked past these men, smiled at them, and trusted them to guard his life. And all the while, to them, he was just the deaf dummy. A paycheck, a ghost in his own house. The betrayal burned, hot and clean, cauterizing the last of his fear. He looked at Irene. She looked furious, her hand tightening into a fist. Thomas shook his head. Not now. He listened. The footsteps were moving away toward the kitchen stairs. The clomp, clomp, clomp of their boots faded. "Clear," Thomas whispered. He pushed the door open. The corridor was empty. "We have to run," Irene said. They sprinted. For Thomas, running was a new, sensory experience. The fabric of his trousers swishing, his own ragged breathing, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. It was a cacophony of exertion. But he focused on the rhythm of it. Left, right, breath. Left, right, breath. They burst out of the service exit and into the storm. The world exploded. If the parlor had been loud, the outside was a war zone. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at his clothes. The rain didn't just fall. It hammered the pavement, the metal awnings, the leaves of the hedges. It was a billion tiny impacts happening all at once. Thomas staggered, shielding his face. The apex red whined, struggling to filter the sheer volume of white noise. "Thomas! This way!" Irene shouted. Her voice was barely audible over the gale, but he saw her waving. She was running toward the far end of the paved lot, away from the sleek lineup of black SUVs and limousines that belonged to the estate. She ran to a faded, dented silver Honda Civic tucked in the shadows of the retaining wall. It was a stark contrast to the millions of dollars of automotive engineering parked 50 feet away, but to Thomas, it looked like a chariot. Irene fumbled with her keys, her hands slick with rain. "Come on, come on!" Chirp, chirp. The locks disengaged. They dove inside. The silence of the car interior was sudden and jarring. The rain was reduced to a dull drumming on the roof. Irene shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. Brrr, lunk! The engine didn't start. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the dashboard. No lights. "No," Irene groaned, hitting the steering wheel. "Not now. Please, not now. It's the starter. It sticks when it's damp." She tried again. Brrr. Thomas looked out the rain-streaked window. Through the gray sheets of water, he saw flashlight beams cutting through the dark near the service door. "They're coming," Thomas said. He listened to the engine trying to turn over. He knew mechanics. He knew machines. "Stop turning it," Thomas commanded. "Pump the gas pedal once, hard, then turn." Irene looked at him, surprised, but obeyed. She stomped on the pedal, then turned the key. Vroom! The engine roared to life. It was a rough, coughing sound. The muffler was clearly shot. But to Thomas, the vibration of the combustion engine traveling through the seat and into his spine was pure power. "Go," Thomas said. Irene threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the wet asphalt, then slammed it into drive. The Honda lurched forward, accelerating toward the service gate. "The gate is closed," Irene yelled, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. The heavy iron service gate was indeed shutting. A guard in a yellow slicker was running from the booth, waving a flashlight, shouting something lost to the wind. "Don't stop," Thomas said. He watched the gap narrowing. 10 feet. 5 feet. Irene didn't brake. She floored it. The Honda shot through the gap with inches to spare. The side mirror clipped. The iron gate with a loud crack and went flying, dangling by a wire against the door. They were out. Irene fishtailed onto the coastal road, the tires finding traction on the slick tarmac. She sped up, putting distance between them and the fortress on the cliff. Thomas turned in his seat to look back. He saw the lights of the manor fading into the storm. He saw the flashlights of the guards stopping at the gate. He exhaled, sinking back into the frayed fabric of the passenger seat. They were moving. They were safe. For now. The adrenaline began to ebb, leaving room for something else. Thomas looked forward. The headlights cut cones of illumination through the driving rain. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm. Thwack, hiss, thwack, hiss. It was hypnotic. "Are you okay?" Irene asked, her eyes glued to the winding road. Thomas started, then stopped. He listened to the sound of the tires singing on the wet pavement. A high-pitched shh. He listened to the turn signal, clicking as Irene navigated a switchback. Click, clack. Click, clack. "I'm hearing," Thomas said simply. He reached out and touched the dashboard. It was vibrating. Everything was vibrating. The world was so much more than he remembered. It wasn't just pictures moving in silence. It was texture. It was depth. Irene glanced at him, her expression softening. She reached over and turned a dial on the center console. "I usually listen to the news," she said. "But maybe—" She pressed a button. The radio crackled, static for a moment, and then a signal cut through. It was music. It wasn't anything profound, just a late-night classic rock station playing an old ballad. But the sound filled the small cabin of the car, the drums, the bass guitar thumping in the door speakers, the soaring notes of a synthesizer. Thomas stopped breathing. He had forgotten music. He remembered the theory of it. He remembered the memory of it. But the physical reality of it? The way the notes layered over each other, creating a landscape of sound that pushed back the dark? He felt tears prick his eyes, not from pain this time, from sheer, overwhelming beauty. "Turn it up," Thomas whispered. Irene turned the volume knob. The guitar solo swelled. Thomas laughed. It was a wet, choked sound, halfway between a sob and a giggle. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes, letting the music wash over him. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's so loud, and it's so beautiful." Irene smiled, tears shimmering in her own eyes as she drove. "It's just the radio, Thomas." "No," Thomas said, opening his eyes and looking at the rain dancing on the glass, each drop tapping out a tiny rhythm. "It's everything. I missed everything." He looked at the thumb drive in his hand, the evidence of theft, betrayal, and malice. Sarah had tried to steal this from him. She had tried to keep him in a silent box while the world sang without him. His grip tightened on the drive. The wonder didn't fade, but it was joined by a steely resolve. "How far to the city?" Thomas asked. 20 minutes, Irene said. "We'll be at the Norwood Tower before the board meeting starts." "Good," Thomas said. He watched the city lights glowing on the horizon, a hazy aura in the storm. "I want to hear what Sarah has to say when I walk through those doors." The Honda Civic rattled and shook as it sped down the highway, carrying a billionaire who had nothing but a thumb drive, a Maid, and a $10 radio, heading into the fight of his life. And for the first time in 10 years, Thomas Norwood was ready to make some noise. The executive boardroom of Norwood Technologies was a fortress of glass floating 50 stories above the city. Soundproofed, climate-controlled, and hermetically sealed against the chaos of the world below, it was designed to be a vacuum where decisions were made in absolute silence. On this Wednesday morning, however, the silence was thick with tension. Sarah Judkins stood at the head of the massive obsidian conference table. She looked haggard, a calculated dishevelment designed to suggest a night spent weeping rather than scheming. Her makeup was slightly smudged, her voice trembling just enough to register as heartbreak. "I cannot emphasize how difficult this is for me," Sarah said, addressing the 12 board members. She gestured to the large screen behind her. A grainy video loop was playing. It showed Thomas from the previous day, the moment in the parlor, captured by a security camera. The audio had been stripped. It showed Thomas clutching his head, stumbling, falling. To his knees, his face contorted in what looked like madness. It showed him shouting at an empty room. "The isolation," Sarah continued, her voice catching, "has finally taken its toll. Dr. Eris believes it's a form of sensory deprivation psychosis. Thomas believes he is hearing things, voices, angels, threats. Yesterday, he assaulted a member of the staff and barricaded himself in his study." She paused, letting the lie settle into the plush carpet. "He is a danger to himself, and, unfortunately, to the stability of this company. That is why, with a heavy heart, I am asking for an emergency invoke of Article 24, immediate temporary suspension of the CEO's authority, pending a psychiatric evaluation." Arthur Sterling, the oldest member of the board and a man who had known Thomas's father, leaned forward. "This is sudden, Sarah. Thomas has been stable for a decade. You're asking us to remove him based on one bad afternoon. I'm asking you to save him." "Arthur," Sarah pleaded, placing her hands on the table, "and to save the stock price. If the press gets wind that our CEO is hallucinating in the hallways—" Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. The other members exchanged uneasy glances. The narrative was compelling. The video was damning. Sarah Judkins had been the voice of the company for 10 years. They had no reason to doubt her translation of reality. "Very well," Arthur murmured. "I call for a vote. Those in favor of invoking Article 24? Sarah held her breath, her eyes scanning the room. One hand went up. Then 2. Then 4. Slam! The double doors of the boardroom didn't just open. They hit the magnetic stops with a violence that shook the walls. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Thomas Norwood stood in the doorway. He looked nothing like the polished, silent figurehead they were used to seeing in annual reports. His expensive suit was soaked through, dark with rain and grease from the ventilation shaft. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His chest was heaving. Beside him stood a woman in a maid's uniform, equally disheveled, her eyes scanning the room like a bodyguard. But it was Thomas's eyes that held the room. They weren't vacant. They weren't lost. They were burning with a terrifying, lucid intensity. "Thomas!" Sarah gasped, the shock genuine even if the concern wasn't. She pointed a shaking finger at him. "Security. How did he get in here? He's having an episode." 2 uniformed guards, who had been stationed inside the room at Sarah's request, moved to intercept. "Mr. Norwood," the lead guard said, reaching for Thomas's arm. "Sir, you need to come with us." Thomas didn't look at the guard. He looked straight down the length of the obsidian table, locking eyes with Sarah. "Don't touch me," Thomas said. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He spoke in a low, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly across the acoustic. Perfection of the room. The guard froze. The board members froze. They had never heard Thomas speak. For 10 years, they had only seen him sign, watched his hands move while Sarah provided the voice. Hearing the actual timbre of the man, deep, rough, and undeniably commanding, was like seeing a statue come to life. "Sit down," Thomas commanded the guard, not breaking eye contact with Sarah. The guard hesitated, looked at Sarah, then backed away. Thomas walked into the room. His wet shoes squeaked on the polished floor. Squeak. Squeak. To Thomas, the sound was annoying, but it was also a declaration of presence. He was here. He was making noise. He walked to the opposite end of the table, facing Sarah. Irene stayed by the door, blocking it, her arms crossed. "I apologize for the interruption," Thomas said, his voice grating slightly, as he pushed his vocal cords to perform. "And for the attire. The ventilation shafts in the manor are dusty." Sarah recovered her wits. She slammed her hand on the table. "He's delirious. Look at him. He thinks he's talking, but he's just mimicking sounds. He doesn't understand what's happening. This is exactly what I was talking about." She turned to the board, her eyes wide. "He's wearing a stolen prototype device. It's uncalibrated. It's scrambling his brain. We need to evacuate the room before he becomes violent." A murmur of fear rippled through the room. Sarah's influence was deep. The sight of the glowing red device behind Thomas's ear, pulsing ominously, unnerved them. Arthur Sterling looked at Thomas, then at Sarah. He leaned over to the woman next to him, a venture capitalist named Ilona, and whispered behind his hand. "He looks like a drowned rat. Is he even lucid?" It was a whisper meant only for Elena. It was barely a breath of air. Thomas turned his head sharply toward Arthur. The Apex red device caught the sibilant frequencies, amplified them, and fed them directly into Thomas's auditory cortex. "I may look like a drowned rat, Arthur," Thomas said clearly, "but I assure you I am perfectly lucid." Arthur's jaw dropped. Elena gasped. Silence, stunned, absolute silence, descended on the room. Sarah went pale. He's lip-reading," she stammered. "He saw you whisper. He's guessing." "I wasn't looking at him," Arthur said slowly, turning to look at Sarah with a dawning suspicion. I had my hand over my mouth. Thomas took another step forward. The sounds of the room were crisp now. The hum of the projector, the rapid heartbeat of the man closest to him, the shallow, terrified breathing of Sarah Judkins. I'm not guessing, Sarah, Thomas said. I'm done guessing. He reached into his wet pocket and pulled out the thumb drive. He held it up. For 10 years, you've told this board that I was fragile, that the world was too loud for me, that I needed you to protect me. He tossed the thumb drive onto the obsidian table. It skittered across the surface, spinning to a stop in front of Arthur. Click. Slide stop. Plug it in, Thomas said. Arthur hesitated, then picked up the drive. He plugged it into his laptop, which was connected to the room's AV system. Don't! Sarah shrieked. She lunged for the laptop, abandoning all pretense of the grieving friend. That's stolen data. That's corporate espionage. If you play that, you're complicit in a felony. Sit down, Sarah, Arthur snapped. The old man's patience had evaporated. He hit the spacebar. The speakers in the ceiling crackled. First came the video file, the security footage from the gate. The board watched in silence as the timestamp showed 9:30 a.m., October 14th. They saw the delivery truck. They saw Sarah signing for the package. They saw her hand the white envelope to Gerald, the company lawyer. Sarah stood frozen, her hands gripping the back of her chair until her knuckles turned white. That proves nothing, she hissed. I signed for a package, so what? Keep watching, Thomas said. Or rather, keep listening. Arthur clicked the next file, the audio recording from the parlor. The quality was crystal clear. The smart home system Thomas had designed himself captured audio at high fidelity. Sarah's voice filled the boardroom, not the hysterical voice she was using now, but the cold, calculating whisper she had used when she thought Thomas was deaf. It's over. The maid found it. The prototype. She put it in his ear. The board members stiffened. Sarah flinched as if slapped. The recording continued. I don't care. He's disoriented. We spin this. We say he had a psychotic break. We have to accelerate the competency hearing now. Tonight. Draft the papers. I'll have security remove the girl and sedate him. The word sedate hung in the air like toxic smoke. Thomas watched the faces of the board members. He saw the shock turn to horror, and the horror turn to anger. They looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw the mask for what it was. The recording ended. Thomas walked to the head of the table. He stood next to Sarah. She was trembling now, a continuous, violent shuddering. You said I was having a psychotic break, Thomas said softly. You said I was dangerous. He turned to the board. Sarah didn't just hide my hearing, Thomas said. She hid the theft of millions of dollars in vendor kickbacks. She hid the Apex Red device that arrived 2 days ago. She threw my life into the trash can because she preferred me broken. He looked at Sarah. You wanted to invoke Article 24? Thomas asked. Let's invoke it, but not for me. Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were wet. But this time, the tears were real. They were tears of rage. I built this company, she whispered, her voice venomous. You were a ghost. I did the work. I made the deals. You sat in your tower and stared at the ocean while I cleaned up your messes. You owe me. I owed you my life, Thomas corrected her, and you stole it. He leaned in close. The red light of the device pulsed against his skin. You wanted to know what I heard in the parlor, Sarah? You wanted to know if I was confused. He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her wait for the sound of his voice. I heard you order my sedation. I heard you plan my commitment. And just now? He gestured to the room, to the board members who were already picking up their phones, calling legal, calling security, calling the police. I can hear your career ending." Sarah let out a strangled sob. She lunged at him, her nails raked into claws, a final, desperate attempt to silence the source of her ruin. Irene was there before Sarah could cross the distance. She didn't tackle her. She just stepped in the way, solid and immovable. "Don't," Irene said. Sarah collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. "Arthur," Sterling stood up. He looked at Thomas with a mixture of shame and awe. "Thomas," Arthur said. We had no idea." "I know," Thomas said. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him exhausted. The noise of the room, the hum of the servers, the murmur of the board members, the distant siren of approaching police cars was starting to blur together again. He looked at Irene. She smiled, a small, tired curving of her lips. Thomas turned back to the table. He reached out and closed the laptop, silencing the frozen image of Sarah's betrayal. "I'm taking back the chair, Arthur," Thomas said. He pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table, Sarah's chair, and sat down. It creaked under his weight. Creak. It was the sound of authority. "Now," Thomas said, looking at the stunned faces of his board, "let's talk about the future." The morning sun hit the terrace of Norwood Manor with a warmth that felt entirely different from the gray, oppressive chill of 3 months ago. It wasn't just the change of seasons. It was the change in frequency. Thomas Norwood sat in a wicker chair, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to the left. He was hunting. He wasn't hunting for market trends or hostile takeover bids. He was hunting for a specific sound in the complex, layered orchestra of the garden. Rustle of oak leaves, high frequency, dry, distant hum of a lawnmower, low frequency, droning, the clink of a spoon against china, sharp, percussive. And then he found it. Cheep trill cheep. A sparrow, hidden somewhere in the ivy climbing the east wall. Thomas smiled. It was a small sound, insignificant to most, but to him, it was a masterpiece. For 10 years, birds had been silent, darting specks of motion. Now, they were musicians. "You're smiling at the bushes again," a voice said. Thomas didn't jump. The Apex Red device, now professionally calibrated and fitted with a custom, discreet casing, had picked up the footsteps on the flagstones long before the voice spoke. He opened his eyes. Irene Bloomfield stood in the doorway of the terrace. She wasn't wearing the gray maid's uniform anymore. She wore a sharp navy blazer over a cream blouse, holding a tablet in one hand and a textbook in the other. She looked tired, the good kind of tired that comes from purpose, not desperation. "I was listening to the sparrow," Thomas said. His voice was no longer a rusty croak. After 12 weeks of intensive speech therapy, the cadence had returned. It was deep, measured, and carried a gravelly resonance that the business press had recently described as commanding. "I think he's arguing with the squirrel." Irene laughed, walking over to sit in the chair opposite him. "The squirrel usually wins. They have better logistics." She placed the tablet on the table. "The legal team sent the final summary," she said, her tone shifting to professional efficiency. "The district attorney accepted the plea bargain on the embezzlement charges, but they're going for maximum sentencing on the medical negligence and assault counts. Sarah isn't getting out for a very long time." Thomas looked at the ocean churning below the cliffs. The name Sarah no longer sent a spike of adrenaline through his system. It was just a word, a relic of a darker time. "And the others?" Thomas asked. "Gerald Vance was disbarred yesterday," Irene reported. "The CFO resigned before the audit was even finished. The cabal is gone, Thomas. The board is fully restaffed." Thomas nodded slowly. "Good." It had been a chaotic 90 days. The revelation in the boardroom had triggered an earthquake in the tech world. Norwood Industries stock had dipped, then skyrocketed as the narrative shifted from crazy CEO 2. The Return of the King. Thomas had leaned into the story. He hadn't hidden the betrayal. He used it. He had restructured the company, launching a new division focused on accessibility technology. The Apex system, the very technology Sarah had tried to suppress, was now the flagship project, with Thomas as its living proof. "And how is the medical school application coming?" Thomas asked, nodding at the thick textbook in Irene's lap. Irene sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Organic chemistry is still a nightmare. But the admissions dean at Hopkins called me back. He saw the press release about my role as your special consultant on accessibility. It turns out, saving a billionaire from a silent prison looks good on a resume." "It should," Thomas said gently. "You didn't just save a billionaire, Irene. You saved the man inside him." He reached for the teapot, pouring 2 cups. The liquid gurgled, a rich, bubbling sound. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, handing her a cup, "about that day in the office, when you knocked over the plant." Irene winced playfully. "I still owe you, for that pot. It was Ming Dynasty or something, wasn't it?" "It was a reproduction from a mall outlet," Thomas grinned. "Sarah just told everyone it was Ming so they wouldn't touch it. But that's not the point." He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "You found the device in the trash. You saw the date. You knew Sarah was dangerous. You knew you could lose your job, your reputation, maybe even your freedom. Most people would have walked away. They would have kept their heads down." Irene looked down at her tea. "I couldn't." "Why?" Thomas pressed. "I know you said it was for your mother. But in that moment, in the parlor, when Sarah walked in, you stood between us. You physically shielded me." Irene looked up. Her eyes were clear, reflecting the bright blue of the sky. "Because silence is heavy, Thomas," she said softly. "I watched my mom carry it for years. I watched her shrink because she didn't want to be a burden. When I saw you standing in that window, you looked like you were disappearing. I couldn't watch another person disappear." Thomas looked at the glowing red light on the device behind his ear. He felt the hum of it against his skull. "I spent 10 years thinking my silence was a physical limit," Thomas said. "I thought my auditory nerves were dead, but the real limit was trust. I trusted the wrong person, so I lived in a cage." He looked at Irene. "You broke the cage. You didn't just hand me a hearing aid. You gave me the truth. And the truth was louder than anything else." A breeze swept across the terrace, rustling the papers on the table. Swish, flap, swish. "So," Irene said, lightening the mood, "now that you're the master of your own destiny again, and the company is saved, and the villain is in jail, what are you going to do today? Conquer another market? Invent a flying car?" Thomas sat back, looking out at the horizon. He listened to the waves crashing against the rocks far below. Crash. Hiss. He listened to the distant drone of a jet engine. He listened to the beat of his own heart. "Actually," Thomas said, reaching up to his ear, "I'm going to do something I haven't been able to do for a decade." Irene watched him, curious. "What?" Thomas's finger found the small tactile switch on the Apex red device. "I'm going to choose," he said. Click. The light on the device went dark. The sound of the ocean vanished. The rustle of the leaves ceased. The sparrow's song was cut off mid-chirp. Silence rushed in. But this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't velvet drapes of lead. It wasn't a prison cell built by a manipulative gatekeeper. It was quiet. It was peaceful. Thomas sat in the absolute silence, watching the wind move through Irene's hair. He watched the way the sunlight caught the rim of her teacup. He watched the world move without the chaotic soundtrack. For a moment, he simply existed in the quiet, knowing that it was no longer a life sentence. It was just a pause, A rest between notes in a symphony. He looked at Irene. She was watching him, a small, knowing smile on her face. She raised her eyebrows as if to say, "Well?" Thomas smiled back. He reached up. Click. The world flooded back in. The wind, the birds, the distant city, and Irene's laughter, warm and bright and real. "I missed that sound most of all," Thomas said. "The ocean?" Irene asked. Thomas shook his head, picking up his tea. "No," he said. "The sound of a friend.